MademmyifyASMR. Welcome back to MademmyifyASMR and welcome to another True Crime Tuesday. Today we are covering part 2 of the Titanic. If you didn't see part 1, I will put a link in the description. Part 2 is going to be all about the voyage and the sinking. For some reason I seem to be struggling to speak today, so apologies if I am just jumbling my words throughout this. I'm going to dive straight into it because part 2 is very long. So, Titanic left Southampton and headed to Cherbourg in France. The crossing was smooth and not a lot was happening aside from the small matter of a coal fire in Bunker 6. Coal fires aboard ships were pretty common and usually caused by the spontaneous combustion of the coal. The easiest way to put out such a fire would be to dig out as much coal as possible, so that was what the stokers set about doing. The Titanic stopped at Cherbourg, where 22 passengers disembarked and a further 274 got aboard. Then, at 10 p.m, Titanic left Cherbourg to sail the 307 miles to Queenstown, which is now called Cobb in Ireland. Again, the journey was smooth with just that still raging coal fire to worry about. At 11:30 a.m. on April the 11th, 1912, Titanic dropped anchor at Queenstown. 7 passengers disembarked and 120 came aboard. Of these passengers that joined at Queenstown, 113 were third-class passengers. At 1:30 p.m, Titanic raised anchor for the last time and began the 2,825-mile journey to New York. As Titanic left Ireland, she followed along the Irish coast to Fascinet Rock. From there, she travelled 1,860 miles along the Great Circle route across the North Atlantic to reach a spot known as the Corner, southeast of Newfoundland, where it was common for westbound steamers to change course. She travelled at an average speed of 21 knots. The journey was uneventful. First-class passengers enjoyed their hors d'oeuvres and cigars, sipping their cognac and being offended by the ball, rich people stuff. Up until April the 13th, the weather remained very mild, but on April the 14th, she encountered a cold weather front with strong winds and 8-foot waves. But as the day progressed, this died down. Also on April the 14th, the fire in the coal bunker was also finally extinguished. A lifeboat drill was originally meant to take place on April the 14th. However, this was cancelled by the captain for reasons unknown. As night fell, the weather turned suddenly very cold. As I mentioned in part 1, Titanic was fitted with a Marconi telegraph and 2 Marconi employed operators. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were aboard to send Marconigrams on behalf of 7:15 p.m, Harold Bride decided to turn off the wireless radio system to allow it to cool down. The previous day it had overheated and this had created a backlog of messages that they were now trying to clear through. With Lightoller at the helm, Smith dined with some of Titanic's most prestigious passengers. By 8:55 p.m, Captain Smith returned to the bridge where he and Lightoller discussed the weather conditions. Lightoller told Smith that it is only 1 degree above freezing. I have sent word down to the carpenter and rung up the engine room and told them it will be freezing during the night. Captain Smith decided to retire for the evening, but reminded Lightoller to slow the ship if conditions became hazy, as well as to inform the crow's nest to be on the lookout for icebergs. By 9:30 p.m, the radio room made contact with mainland America. Because of the massive telegrams, Harold Bride made a fateful decision not to pass on an ice warning from the nearby steamer Mesaba. The warning was of packed ice and large bergs. Shortly after this, Jack Phillips took over the telegraph. He assumed Bride had passed on all ice warnings, so didn't relay the ice warning that was just sat on the desk. At around 10 p.m, the lights in the public rooms in both second and third class were put out to encourage passengers to head to their cabins, whilst the cigars, drinks and conversation continued to flow in the first class lounges. Lightoller handed the helm to First Officer William Murdoch. As he handed over, the two discussed the weather conditions and Captain Smith's wishes if visibility were to change. Lightoller inspected the decks and then went to bed. At 10:40 p.m, an overworked and stressed Phillips received a loud message from SS California. "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice," to which he replied, shut up, I'm busy." After this exchange, California's wireless operator switched off the receiver and went to bed. Now, old man was Phillips's call sign. It wasn't an insult. The ocean was calm and the air was clear, but there was no moon. Because of the calmness of the water, there was nothing to give away the position of icebergs. A mix-up at Southampton had also meant that the lookouts had no binoculars, though these likely wouldn't have helped that much due to the darkness of the night. At 11:39 p.m, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg in Titanic's path. He rang the lookout bell 3 times and phoned the bridge to inform the 6th officer, James Moody. "Iceberg right ahead." William Murdoch is generally believed to have given the order hard a starboard, which would mean the ship would be turned to port. Murdoch was likely attempting to port around the iceberg, a manoeuvre where you swing the bow around the obstacle followed by the stern to avoid the collision. I believe it was a similar manoeuvre that the Costa Concordia attempted when that sank, but I don't know, so don't quote me on that. There was a delay before the order could be carried out, as the steam-powered steering took 30 seconds to turn the tiller and reversing the ship's engines took time. Ironically, if Murdoch had kept the ship going forward, the Titanic might have missed the iceberg by mere feet. In 2010, the granddaughter of Charles Lightoller claimed the helmsman had panicked and turned the rudder in the wrong direction. Bruce Ismay had ordered Titanic to continue slow ahead, believing it was unsinkable, but apparently this was covered up because of the insurance implications. Titanic's heading changed just in time to avoid a head-on collision, but the iceberg caught a glancing blow against the ship. An underwater spur of ice scraped along the starboard side of the ship for 7 seconds, and chunks of ice dislodged from the berg and fell onto the ship's forward wood compartments filled, the watertight doors closed, and any sailors in these compartments would have drowned quickly. Titanic could stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded, but was now taking on water in 5 compartments, and the 6th compartment was also beginning to flood. Captain Smith arrived at the bridge and ordered all stop, and all of the ship's engines were turned off. It very quickly became apparent that Titanic would sink. At 12:05 a.m. on April the 15th, Captain Smith ordered the ship's lifeboats uncovered and the passengers mustered. He also ordered the radio operators to begin sending distress calls. Titanic's first distress calls used CQD, which was a call sign commonly used by British telegraphers, meaning CQ plus the D for distress or danger. Harold Bride at the time was relaxed enough to joke that perhaps they should try SOS, as it was the new signal and it may be their last chance to use it. It's a common misconception that SOS means save our ship or save our souls, but the letters didn't actually stand for anything. It was an adaptation of a German radio call, and it was simple to tap out and understand it in an emergency. SOS had been officially ratified as the official international distress call in 1908, but British and Marconi operators had been slow to adopt it. The thoroughness of the muster was heavily dependent on the class of the passenger. First class stewards only had a few passengers to attend to compared to those assigned to second and third class, while first class stewards provided hands-on assistance. Those for second and third class focused on opening doors below decks and telling passengers to put on life vests. The passengers were not told the ship was sinking, though a few did notice that she was listing. I think it's a bit of a misconception that there were not enough life vests on the Titanic. There were more life vests on the Titanic than there were passengers. Meanwhile, on the Carpathia, Harold Cottam, the ship's wireless operator, returned from the bridge and decided to listen to transmissions. Even though his shift had ended, he kind of had it on while he was unlacing his boots for the night. He received a message from Cape Cod stating they had private traffic for Titanic. Thinking that he would be helpful, at 12:11 a.m. he sent a message to Titanic, and in return he received the distress call stating that they had struck an iceberg and needed urgent assistance. Cottam went straight to the bridge, where the officers there were sceptical about the seriousness of the distress call. Agitated, Cottam decided to wake up Carpathia's captain, Arthur Henry Rostron. There will be a lot more coming up about him in part 3. He is just hero. He sprang into action, sending for the chief engineer to tell him to call another watch of stokers and make all speed for the Titanic. Carpathia was 67 miles away from Titanic at the time. Rostron ordered the ship's heating and hot water cut in order to divert all steam to the engine room. Extra lookouts were also put in place to watch for icebergs. Cottam, meanwhile, messaged Titanic to let them know that the Carpathia was coming as quickly as possible and they expected to arrive in 4 hours. Cottam refrained from sending any more signals in an attempt to keep the network clear for the Titanic. After the initial order by the stewards to put on life belts, many passengers thought this was a joke, some even beginning to play football with the chunks of ice on the foredeck. Meanwhile, crew began preparing lifeboats on the boat deck. Now, another reason the passengers might not have wanted to go onto the boat deck would have been that it was very, very noisy. The boilers had been running at full power and had only just been put out, and all of the steam from the boilers needed to be vented to prevent the boilers exploding, and also to prevent the risk of when was lifeboat number 7, was rowed away from Titanic. Meanwhile, below deck, crew fought to maintain vital services as water continued to pour into the ship below deck. The engineers and firemen continued to work, venting steam from the boilers to prevent explosion. They opened up watertight doors to set up extra portable pumps in the forward compartments in a futile bid to reduce the torrent of water. They also worked to keep the ship's electrics running. There is a legend of the Titanic that the electrics were maintained throughout, though according to the Carpathia, she was running on reserve battery at one point, so that part maybe was not true. One of the stewards, F. Dent Ray, narrowly avoided being swept away when a wooden wall between his quarters and third-class accommodation on E-deck collapsed, leaving him waist deep in freezing water. Jonathan Shepherd broke his leg while battling to pump water out of Boiler Room 5. He and Herbert Harvey unfortunately both lost their lives when the door separating Boiler Room 5 and 6 collapsed, causing them to be swept away by a wave of green foam, according to the lead fireman, who barely managed to escape. In Boiler Room 4 at around 1:20 a.m, water began flooding from below. This flow of water overwhelmed the pumps and forced the firemen and trimmers to evacuate the forward boiler rooms further aft, which is towards the stern or the back of the ship. Chief Engineer Bell, some of the engineers and a handful of firemen and greasers stayed behind in the unflooded boiler rooms, which were 1, 2 and 3, as well as the turbine and reciprocating engine rooms, keeping the ship's lighting and pumps operating. Late into the sinking, when they realised there was nothing more that could be done, they came up onto the deck, but by this point all the lifeboats had left. None of Titanic's 35 engineers and electricians survived. Neither did Titanic's 5 postal clerks. They spent their time trying to save these sacks of mail that they had. Funnily enough, though, no mail has ever been recovered from the wreckage of the Titanic, though I assume that's because it would probably have disintegrated quickly, being paper. Stepping back in time a little and back to the boat deck, initially passengers had been reluctant to leave the warm, well-lit Titanic, which showed no immediate signs of danger. This was part of the reason why some of the lifeboats lowered half empty. It was hoped that some of the boats would come back and help those in the water. Some passengers were also unsure as to how structurally sound these lifeboats were, because they were just like little wooden boats, and the collapsibles were just canvas boats. Bruce Ismay, White Star's managing director, actually left on one of the collapsibles, something he was heavily criticised for. Other passengers, including Father Thomas Biles and Margaret Brown, who became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, a bit more on her later and in part 3, helped women and children into lifeboats. Eventually, 2 men grabbed Brown and forced her into lifeboat 6. She survived, but unfortunately Father Biles did not. By 1:25 a.m, the situation on the lifeboat deck became chaotic, as passengers realised there were far more people than places on lifeboats. The boarding became increasingly rushed and disorganised, with some lifeboats entering the water overloaded and in a very rushed manner. One woman fell between lifeboat 10 and the side of the ship, but was luckily caught and hauled back up before boarding successfully. Annie Stengel, a first-class passenger, broke several ribs when an overweight German-American doctor and his brother jumped into lifeboat 5 and knocked her unconscious. As lifeboat 6 was lowered, it nearly became flooded by water discharging from the ship's side, but it was successfully lowered. Lifeboat number 3 nearly tipped all the passengers out of it when a divot became jammed. Part of the problem was that, as this was Titanic's maiden voyage, few of the crew had training or understanding on how to dispel the lifeboats. When lifeboat 14 was lowered, 5th Officer Lowe was forced to fire 3 almost lowered into one of Titanic's pumps, but was pushed away with an oar at the last minute, saving 70 lives of those on board. By 1:35 a.m, lifeboat 15 and 16 left the ship, meaning all lifeboats in the second class section were now gone. 6 lifeboats were left. These were located in first class and had a combined capacity of 293. There was still an estimated 1,800 still aboard at this point. A major turning point occurred at 1:40 a.m. when the holes for the bow anchor dipped under the water. This allowed water to flood the rest of the bow, which until this point had remained dry. A few minutes later, the ship lurched forward suddenly as below deck the watertight bulkhead between boiler rooms 5 and 6 collapsed. This bulkhead had been weakened by the fire several days earlier. This sudden movement and increased angle of tilt further alerted passengers to the impending danger, and there was an outbreak of panic. At 1:45 a.m, Titanic's wireless signal became faint, indicating the electrics had failed and that she was running on reserve batteries. Collapsible C left Titanic around 2 a.m, followed by D 5 minutes later, as lifeboat 4 tried to help people caught in the freezing water. As Titanic continued to sink, telegraph operators Bride and Phillips began switching between SOS and the CQD. Their distress calls were sloppily relayed, and they could also only send or receive one message at a time. Their line was repeatedly tied up with irrelevant questions and confused operators. Amateur radio operators also interfered with Titanic's messages. It's thought that this was how the news of the sinking first reached New York, because these amateur wireless operators had intercepted the signal. At 2:05, the seawater reached the bottom of the bridge rail. All lifeboats, apart from collapsibles A and B, which were awkwardly located, had been lowered. When B was lowered, it had 3 spare seats. At this point, Titanic's bronze propeller began to rise above the waterline in front of lifeboat 2, which was located just off the stern. Water then began flooding the forward deck through the crew hatches on the bridge. At this time, Captain Smith released Harold Bride and Jack Phillips from their duties before quietly wandering off into the bridge. Bride went to gather money from their quarters while Phillips continued working. When Bride returned, he found a fireman attempting to steal Phillips's life vest. Bride and Phillips managed to knock the man unconscious as water began entering the radio room. Both men ran onto the deck, and Bride helped with collapsible B, whilst Phillips ran to the aft. At this time, Carpathia had travelled 24 miles and was 34 miles from Titanic's position. As the last 2 lifeboats left the ship, collapsible A, half filled with water, and collapsible B capsized, and 30 men clung onto it. Shortly after, the forward expansion joint, which was located behind the first funnel, was pulled apart by the weight of the rising stern. This put strain on two of the funnel's cable stays. The cable snapped and the funnel fell forward, crushing the starboard boat wing. On deck, people scrambled for the stern or jumped overboard, hoping to reach a lifeboat. Father Biles spent his final moments reciting prayers, hearing confessions, and giving absolution to those huddled around him. The ship's stern rose about 15 to 35 degrees. This was until 2:18 a.m. when the ship's electrics went out permanently and the second funnel broke off. This fell into the water. Around the same time, structure beneath funnel 3 completely It probably should be visual, but yeah. The stern section was pulled up by the sinking bow and the weight of the engines, but this was only temporary, and the stern soon sank below the icy waters 2 hours and 40 minutes after it struck the iceberg. When the stern rose up, those in the lifeboats thought it was some miracle and that it was going to continue to float and that the Titanic was saved. But yeah, it was very short-lived. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, hundreds of passengers and crew were left dying in the icy sea, surrounded by debris. As some of the debris rocketed to the surface from the sinking ship, this likely killed and injured many of those who were swimming in the water. At -2 degrees, the water was lethally cold. Almost all of those in the water died of cardiac arrest or other bodily reactions to the freezing temperatures within 15 to 30 minutes. Those on the lifeboats would have been overwhelmed by the sounds of screams, followed by an eerie silence. It's a misconception that people died of hypothermia. I don't think they were alive long enough for hypothermia to set in. Like, I think some of the people who died in the lifeboats probably did, but no one in the water died of hypothermia. It was other cold water related issues. I don't know if that's the right word to use. At this point, the Carpathia was still around an hour away from the Titanic's location, and it had been forced to slow because of the icebergs in the water. As I mentioned earlier, Molly Brown was in lifeboat 6. She took an oar in the lifeboat to help sail it and urged Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to let them return to save more people. The two argued, and eventually Molly, sick of his behaviour, threatened to throw him overboard. It's not known whether they did or didn't row back, but by this point there wouldn't have been anyone left to find. Even though there was an extra capacity of up to 500 in the lifeboats, only 13 people were pulled from the water. Part of that was because those who were manning the lifeboats were worried that if they did return, that everyone in the water would kind of swarm the lifeboats trying to get in, and that would cause the lifeboats to capsize. There was also some worries that as Titanic went under, that this would create a vacuum and that would suck the lifeboats under, so they were very reluctant to return. Those in the lifeboats had no food or water, and most had no lights, because they weren't required on a lifeboat at that time. Collapsible B, which had capsized, was kept afloat only by a small pocket of air in the upturned hull, and that was getting smaller and smaller. As dawn approached, the sea became choppy, forcing those on the collapsed boat to stand up to balance it. Some were just so exhausted that they fell off the boat and drowned. At 4 a.m. on April the 15th, Carpathia arrived. It took several hours for those in the lifeboats to be brought aboard. Those left on Collapsible B managed to board 2 of the other boats, but one person unfortunately died before the transfer. Collapsible A was in a lot worse condition. That was the one that half filled with water. More than half of those aboard had died overnight. 3 bodies were actually left in the Collapsible, and it was recovered a month later by Oceanic, with the bodies still aboard. The survivors came aboard by various means, with children being lifted in mail sacks, and by 9:15 a.m. California and Mount Temple both appeared on the scene. They attempted to find survivors, of which there were none. Carpathia had been bound for Rijeka in Croatia, but without the facilities to cater for all of these extra passengers, Rostron ordered the ship be returned to New York. Now that is all of